Now, it's believed that a woman is murdered every 4 hours in South Africa, with many dying at the hands of those they think they know best, and that's their intimate partners. Prominent men, including the likes of Aurthur Mafokate, Mduduzi, Manana, and Khalo, Matabane, are among those who've made headlines with links to the alleged abuse or rape of women. Women and child abuse has reached crisis levels in this country. So how do you know that you're in an abusive relationship, and when's the right time to get out? To chat more about this, I'm joined by Nonhlanhla Skosana, who's a gender activist at Sonke Gender Justice, as well as Vetten, who's a research associate at Wits University. Ladies, very good morning to you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks.
Nonhlanhla, let me start with you and look at a report that Sonke Gender Justice did in conjunction with Sweat, and that looks at a group of women who are oftentimes marginalized out of the conversation when we talk about women abuse, and that is the plight of sex workers. The report talks about how sex workers are oftentimes even abused by the very people who are supposed to be protecting them, and that is the police. Talk to us about that first.
Yes, Sonke has issued a report in partnership with Sweat, and we engaged with sex workers in different spaces, and it is true that sex workers are experiencing an ordeal in South Africa, and more especially by the South African police. And it is very sad to know that if sex workers, they even go to police to report cases of gender-based violence, they end up being, abused by the same police who are supposed to take the statements and make sure that the perpetrators are held to account in terms of what they are doing to sex workers. So it is a very serious issue for us to say, as South Africans, as the service providers, we need to understand that sex workers are human beings, women who are out there to work for their families, and some of them, they feed families and they take kids to schools, they provide food for their own families. Some, they have unemployed parents and those who are depending on them as workers. So it is very bad to know that even if they are being violated, they are being discriminated for the mere fact that they are sex workers.
We'll get into more detail on that in just a moment, but I'd like us to look at page 6 of the City Press. And the headline says, "What we do to our children. Decades-long study shows that 99% of children in South Africa have witnessed violence or have been a victim of it before they turn 18. That is so scary when you think about these are the people that you date, these are the people that you interact with, these are the people that you work with. Do we attribute this growing up and seeing violence? Is it fair to say that you then become an abuser because you have been abused?
You certainly put at a very high risk. You're also at a very high risk of being victimized in the same way. Part of the reason is that it's normalized. It's how you see adults relate to each other. It's how adults relate to you. So the picture you get is that's just how people talk to each other. That's the way we deal with difficulties in our relationship. But I think there's also the harm that it does to a child to be abused or to observe something like that. It damages them in a range of different ways. So that it's very, for instance, their ability to trust other people is very profoundly damaged because the people who they're supposed to trust have hurt them. And they've learned from being young that some people who love you hurt you. And I think parents often give the very mistaken message to children when they hit them. Oh, I'm only doing this because I love you. But you're telling a child that when you love somebody, you hurt them. And if that's the message they get, you're setting them up for some real difficulties in relationships. I mean, I think they've also observed somebody having to stay in a relationship because they're economically dependent. They haven't seen what kind of options might exist, what other kinds of role models are there. So it's not just within the home, that it might be in a broader community. There's just a lack of help and a lack of assistance. And I think also, our helping systems are often they're either absent altogether, they're just not there, or they're quite disrespectful. So that also puts women off from going to seek help because they may be abused by the police.
So when you're talking about our helping systems, what are you talking about?
I'm talking about
the police.
I'm talking about the police, I'm talking about the courts, I'm talking about healthcare, and I'm talking about social services. They're either just not there at all. I mean, many communities, there are no domestic violence shelters. And I think many women go to hospitals, often the first place they go for help. And from some of the research we've done, you come in, the doctor sees this is the second time you're back in 3 months with injuries, but they don't ask questions. They just give you Panado to kill the pain, stitch up your injuries, and send you home. So again, by not asking, they're communicating the message. This is not something we talk about. This is just normal. We just send you home.
So that's when things have escalated to a point where you're actually reporting it. Let's backtrack, Nonhlanhla, and look at what you actually look out for when you are with somebody from the work that you do. What do you find that women often tell you in terms of the way someone speaks to you or in terms of the way someone engages with you, that this is a display of abuse? Are you aware when you are even being abused?
In most cases, we are aware when we are abused, but because of the way we've been socialized, we have normalized abuse. You know, if a person talks to you in a bad way and you tend to say, I'm not comfortable with the way you talk to me, and more especially if it's a man, you as a woman, you are seen as being disrespectful, and you know, in certain cultures, you are trimmed and taught how to behave as a woman, how to engage with the man in a manner that the man is superior than you and you are an inferior. And that is why in other cultures you find out that women are being categorized as children. You'd hear men saying, I'm going to work for my children. Those children number one, it's a woman, and then the rest, you know. So that's how it is. And in terms of, you know, realizing that you are being abused, the way a person relates to you, you could feel it, you could sense it, that I, as a person, I don't really appreciate how this person is talking to me, but it goes further to say, what are the things that that particular person engages with you in terms of making decision in your own space with that particular person? When they start to see themselves as better than you, who can think and reason better than you, but because you are a woman, you don't have the brain enough to reason in a very same space with the men, then you start to realize that you are not being taken as an equal into this relationship. Then it escalates where they start pointing you with a finger, and when you tell your family members, they will say, what's wrong with being pointed with a finger? He didn't even beat you. You know, you're a woman, you are deaf. You know, you must understand this person is a man, and maybe he has paid lobola for you. Those are some of the things that they say. And then it will go as further as that person, you know, beating you. We were talking off air to say, if mostly black women are getting married, they would give you a kiss. And what are they telling you is that you are getting out of this house with this box and you ain't coming back anytime. You will go out of that family with a box, which is your coffin. So those are the kind of things that, you know, you see as a woman, that this is where abuse starts.
Lisa, from the work that you do, just to elaborate on what she said, do you find that when women go to people that they think they can trust, who would be their immediate family members or somebody who's their best friend, to say, hey, this is the situation, and even if you're going back 10 times and you're saying, yo, the 10th time this is happening, do you find that they often get turned away by the very people whom they think they can get help from?
Yes, and I think family and friends are really very important. They are the first people that women turn to. Family, unfortunately, often give women the message that you should go back. You should try harder. Marriage is not easy. You don't give up the first time there's a little bit of difficulty. You know, women must endure. There's that other expression, women hold the sharp edge of the knife in a relationship. So they often get given this message to go back, keep trying harder, told not to, you know, to think about the children. What's the effect on the children if you deprive them of their father? If they're religious, it might be messages like, you know, go home and pray harder. God doesn't send us what we cannot overcome. Just try harder. Think about what you're doing wrong. You know, go and examine your own behavior. So I think that, unfortunately, plays a very powerful role in trapping women within those relationships. They may want to leave, they may leave sooner, but if that's the message they're getting, then they are going to feel that they have to stay. I think the thing with friends can be a bit more complicated. Friends often start out being supportive, but they can get quite frustrated if women keep going back. And I mean, one ends up with a situation where they'll say, I'm sorry, I just can't be your friend anymore. It's too stressful for me to see you getting beaten. I talk to you and then you go back. And out of that frustration, they often are obviously cutting themselves off from the woman. And that's a real problem, because one of the difficulties that women face in abusive relationships is isolation. As one of the first tactics that abusive partners use is to cut you off from your family and friends, your support base, really. So once that starts happening, there's nobody for you to turn to when you have a problem. But the other thing is that all you are hearing all the time is how useless and pathetic you are. You don't have friends and family to say, actually, that's not true, you are a good person. So if you're hearing this all the time, it does break you down. You do start to believe that's true, that is what I really am.
Nonhlanhla, in this conversation of gender-based violence, we cannot exclude the LGBTIQA community. There's a lot of queer women who go missing, some who get killed, corrective rape. When we look at that from the work that you do, what do you find are the driving factors there?
I'm just happy that we're talking about, because yesterday we were like commemorating this the anti-homophobia day. It's very bad to know that mostly here in Ekurhuleni, a lot of lesbian women were brutally killed and dumped in front of their family's house. And we had a number of them. And it's just also so sad that even in reporting, their cases are underreported. And unfortunately, because of homophobia in our society, which is informed by a number of things, the religious sector, our cultural norms and values that we say are values, are really perpetrating homophobia and mostly, targeting young girls who are lesbians. And for us as community, when we engage, when we talk about women, we tend to talk more about heterosexual women and not really talking about women as a whole, because as you have asked me around women who are sex workers, women who are lesbians, gays, queers, and who don't want to associate themselves with any gender stereotypes, then those are the women that men in our society are targeting and say, what's wrong with you? Why are you not interested to engage and be in relationships with men? So by so doing, they use the so-called corrective rape when they force themselves into these young women, rape them, but over and above beyond that, kill them. They even target them in spaces like taverns, because they say you're not supposed to be in this space, you are a woman and you are not a straight woman. That's the language that we use. So it is very bad that lesbians, women, are being violated and they are being discriminated against. We know of situation of young women in schools where we have programs for young boys, and you could hear how these young women are being isolated and discriminated by their own peers who are male, but also their own peers who are women who don't want to engage with them because they say we cannot understand you. And these young women, they are not given an opportunity and a right in this South Africa that we say is democratic after 24 years to have their own choice in terms of sexual orientation. So that's the challenge that we have, that we still need to engage from a very low level, from the primary school level to, our working spaces.
Lisa, while we equip girls on how to defend themselves, while we equip girls on how to sort of be there for themselves or notice signs of abuse, where are the men in the conversation, or the boys? Why are we neglecting the boys who end up being people's partners, who end up heading big corporations and abusing their powers?
I think it's very important when we talk about violence against women that we actually also look at men's violence towards each other, because the two are not completely unrelated to each other. If we look at our homicide rates in South Africa, for example, our women's rates, as you began this program, are very high. But men murder each other at 5 times the rate they murder women in this country. That's really startling and alarming. But in many ways we can't talk about it, because when we speak of victimization and vulnerability in this country, we've really feminized it. When we think the word victim, usually it's a woman who comes to mind. And I think for that reason it makes it very difficult for men to acknowledge feelings of vulnerability, helplessness and powerlessness. We all expect them to be these macho, gung-ho, aggressive types. And we associate masculinity with violence and aggression. So I think it's very important that we find ways to allow men to speak about their victimization. Because again, going back to those figures you were quoting at the beginning, it's very clear that men who were victimized as children are at risk of being perpetrators as adults. So we have to look at how do we assist somebody who's been both a victim and a perpetrator. How do we make it possible for them to admit their vulnerability and to find different ways of, when they do feel vulnerable, not responding violently? So I think that we've got to look at in terms of schools. I mean, schools, I think, are very important places where you can try to teach different ways of dealing with difficulty. It's also a place where teachers can pick up children who do have difficulties and behavioural problems. I think we also need to look at the horrendous and appalling underfunding of services in this country. Very often there's nowhere you can actually go or send a child to. So there's no point in even identifying them, because what help can you offer them or their family? So I think that has got to be key. Only 10% of the budget of social development at this point goes towards services. That's really grossly inadequate. So I think we have to be looking at that as well. And then I think there's also questions around what sort of programs could be run with young men when they become, you know, when we do pick up that they do have problems. What can be done? But at this point, I think there's just a great big gap around how do we deal with those who already are displaying violent tendencies. At this point, there's nothing we can do for them except leave them to carry on.
Sure. Nonhlanhla, in closing, as we talk about reports that we see in newspapers, we talk about reports that we see on television, or rather, let me phrase it this way, what advice would you give to us media people who report on issues of violence and who report on stories of women or even men who've been abused?
As Sonke Gender Justice, we have developed a guide for reporting of gender-based violence for journalists and editors. And in that guide, what is more important is that if we report on gender-based violence, we need to make sure that our reporting is for the benefit of the survivors. It respects the survivor. I think we've just heard now about the interview that was had with Babes Zodumo, and when you listen to it, you feel that this Babes has been secondary victimized during the interview, but at the very same time, when you listen to Mas Chaba, you feel that you need to really engage with her and say, as a woman in that space, she feels, you know, responsible to fight for her sister. She feels she needs to talk about this. She's very passionate about it. But how do you do that? What that does to the survivor? You know, so in that part of conversation, that's what is missing, to say, I wish that most of the journalists and editors could have access to that guide. It's in our website, the Sonke website, that will assist us, because it's very important to report gender-based violence. And we cannot say it must not be reported, but the manner in which it's been reported, does it respect the survivor? Does it really looks at fairness and in terms of how the whole thing is dealt with? And as I was speaking to you, I was saying we tend to take responsibility and want to think on behalf of the survivors. We don't have to do that. When they talk to you and say, I've been violated, yes, we believe you. And then we need to listen to the survivors to guide us. How does she or he wants to deal with the whole issue? When she wants to open a case, it's okay, we support her. But if she doesn't, then it's her choice. And we also, you know, make sure that there is information that she can be able to deal with the whole thing. Because in a space where we're saying we try to support and assist the survivor, we tend to victimize them further than what they've been going through.
Ladies, thank you so much for coming through this morning to talk to us. Really appreciate it. It was a great pleasure. That was gender activist Nonhlanhla Skosana and research associate Lisa Vetten.